We now come to the backbench debate on landfill tax fraud. Sir Kevan Jones to move.
Thank you, Roger. Can I move this debate and say how pleased I am that the Backbench Business Committee have agreed to this debate. Now, when and can I thank honourable members from across the House for their support in securing it. When I secured this debate, a journalist came up the other day and said, "What's landfill tax fraud?" And I said, yeah, I do accept it's quite a niche subject. I would perhaps suggest it might be seen as an anorak subject.
No, never.
But it's something I've been involved along with the Right Honourable for Holden Price and Howard for nearly 10 years now. And I think he would agree with me, we're both proud anorak wearers when it comes to this, because this is a serious issue for the UK. And certainly my involvement and the more I dig into this, is there are solutions to it that there's just been blind eyes turned to by various government agencies. And there's no political will to really grasp it in terms of the devastating effect it's having on our revenue collection, but also in terms of various communities as well. Have we made progress? Well, slightly, but we've had missed opportunities, I would also say, over the years. And again, I can't, and I think the right honourable gentleman who's been involved as long as I have with this, can't understand why this has not been grasped when there have been clear solutions, some provided by industry, some provided by myself and the right honourable gentleman, other members. But landfill tax was introduced in 1996, and its aim was, quite honourably, and it was to reduce the amount of domestic waste and other waste that goes into landfill tax and try and push recycling, which no one could disagree with. And you could argue that it's actually worked in terms of reducing the amount of going down to landfill. Well, it has, but it's also, I think, a question mark of how effective it's been in terms, because you actually don't know what's going into landfill in terms, and I'll explain it later. But this is a industry which is worth some £9 billion a year. So this is not a small part of our economy. Unlike anything which generates large amounts of revenue, it attracts criminals and those people who want to exploit the system. And I would suggest the way in which government has dealt with this area of lack of regulation, lack of oversight, you've ended up in a situation where we've allowed criminals and others to benefit from the system that's been set up. And as the PAC report recently said, landfill tax is basically, and waste crime in this country is basically been decriminalised because of the lack of action. But so people might say, well, why is it important? Well, it's important because, one, it's costing the public. Well, this is tax revenues which we are not collecting and could go to support all the things which our constituents want. But it's also funding serious and organised crime gangs, and they're also undercutting legitimate businesses who are paying their taxes, following the regulations, being undercut by these individuals. The other one is the environmental cost to this, because there is going to be a cost in the future, because some of these waste sites, because we don't know what's been actually disposed in them, there's ultimately going to be an environmental cost to the environment in terms of future degradation of those sites. And in some cases, there are going to be calls for those sites to be remediated. And who will pick the cost of that up? It will be the taxpayer which will pick the...
Well, don't give way.
Yeah.
First of all, can I commend them for this, and it's not just here in the UK mainland where we have these problems, we have them in Northern Ireland as well. I'm ever mindful of what the right honourable member is saying, which and others will say as well, I think, to reinforce it. Is it the intention through this debate to ask the Minister to look towards legislative change to ensure that those who break the law, those criminal gangs that break the law, that they will be in receipt of punitive fines and imprisonment at a level that commensurates the type of activities that they're involved in? In other words, they need to be more punished for what they do.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable for Stratford intervention, but that's the frustration point. It doesn't need new legislation, it just needs action on government to actually implement and fund the existing powers that it has. And the fourth one, which you mentioned about his own part of the United Kingdom, is the effects it has on local communities. And I know my honourable friend, the member for Blaydon, and the honourable member for Nixon and the right honourable member for Holton, Price and Howden will raise specific examples in their constituencies where local communities feel completely powerless to stop the huge environmental damage which this is causing to their local area. And it's not, can I say, Sir Roger, anything to do with the lack of triumph for the three honourable members and right honourable member who I know have campaigned for many years trying to get change on this. But the cost is first the public purse. Now, the PAC report estimates that the cost of landfill tax fraud and waste crime is about £1 billion a year. I've got to say, that's like putting your finger in the air and going like that, because basically no one knows. But I would say that's a conservative estimate at what is being lost through landfill tax fraud. And that's because of as the PAC report said, we've basically given up actually trying to monitor what's actually happening. Now, how does it work, in practice? Well, it works, well, there are certain strands to it, can we say. The first one was the way in which landfill tax was actually implemented. There are two rates, and from 2008 to 2014, those rates of taxation have gone up. So you've got what they call inert waste, things that haven't got things that are active in them, which currently is £3.15 pence a tonne. And the standard rate for ordinary waste is £98.60 pence per tonne. And the first criminality is what you do is you put things down as inert waste when actually it's not inert waste. And there's no monitoring of this at all. So you're instantly making a fortune if you're avoiding taxation. And the Environment Agency don't really implement this. And I'm sure if you went on some of these sites and did boreholes, you would find that sites that are supposed to have only inert waste in it, well, I find will not have that. So that's the first way. And the problem there is we've got sites where we actually don't know what's actually in those sites. So the environmental thing for the future, but the incentive for misconception has done that because the inert waste and the huge gap between the two has actually led to this. Then we have the situation of illegal sites, people who are running illegal sites where there's no licensing and it's just dumped and they've been operating, again, without any real sanction. You buy a field, an old quarry, and just keep putting in. You don't pay any landfill tax because you've nothing to do it. Then there's the other one, which is far more sophisticated, and I'll come on to an example in a minute, and that's where criminal elements buy or set themselves up as legitimate waste operators. And you say, well, is that very easy? Well, it is, because there are no restrictions on who can become a waste operator. So if you buy an existing business, or you buy a quarry or something like to dispose of landfill, label it and say, right, you're going to collect waste. Again, who is checking? One, so you can run two scams. You can run the first scam, which is the inert and the active waste, or you can actually just declare, say, half of what you're putting in there.
I'm very grateful to the honourable member opposite for giving way, and I thank him for bringing this debate. He's absolutely right that you can set up or indeed take over a site with no qualifications, but also no checks as to whether you're a fit and proper person. You might have a criminal record within the waste sector itself, as was the case in Wally's Quarry in Newcastle-under-Lyme, and yet the Environment Agency appear powerless to do anything about that to stop these people operating landfills.
I'm going to come on to in a minute. You only have to look at the directors of the company, and I know the right honourable member for Holton and Howden's aware of these individuals. You would think, these people, it wouldn't take a great Google search or a police officer look on the police computer to find that these people have got no interest in waste crime until they understand how lucrative it is. So it's become a very profitable business. And if you look at the PAC report of last April, which came off the back of pressure from myself and the Right Honourable Member and others, and you get a situation where 60 of the main organised crime groups, 70% of them are involved in money laundering, 60% are involved in other illegal activities, are involved in landfill tax fraud. Now, what that does is two things, and I'll come on to the example in a minute. But it's a way of washing money, it's a way of hiding money, it's also a way of generating huge sums of cash, which is in terms of putting drugs money into it and other things, and you know, it's a license to print money, because if you're not actually declaring what's going in, then, you know, well, you'd think then, Sir Roger, you'd think, well, yeah, but surely someone has actually noticed this. And so, well, yeah, people have been screaming about this for years. Are the police onto it? Are HMRC or Environment Agency? And they're not. And I give the one simple fact. How many successful prosecutions have there been for landfill tax fraud since 1996? Not one single example. The example now I come on to is the, I think, interestingly named, I'd love to know why they named it, was called Operation Nosedive. Now, Operation Nosedive, which was based with a company on the activities of a company called Miramax in Hartlepool in the northeast of England. And they operated in the northeast, but they also operated, and I'm sure the Right Honourable Gentleman will allude to it later on. So the HMRC instigated a operation called Operation Nosedive. And this was into illegal tax fraud. Now, I've been told by individuals in the northeast about this company. What they did, they set themselves up, bought into the waste management business. They've got various sites around the northeast and other parts of the country. And we're running both scams, I think, in terms of the scam, in terms of the inert and the active waste, but also it begs the question of how much landfill tax was actually being paid on stuff they were dumping. And I had someone explain it to me that if you actually looked at what Miramax were charging companies for taking away their waste, there is no way they could have been charging that rate if they were paying the full landfill tax charge. Likewise, why would you be transporting waste from South Wales, from a council in South Wales to the northeast, and it make it economically viable to do so? But this got quite a big operation. Certain local companies did go out of business because they were being undercut by this company. And if you look at how big this got, if I told you, Sir Roger, that, you know, 3 regional police forces, Northumbria, Cleveland and Northumbria, all had contracts with this company. Now, if you then looked at the directors of the company and you saw their backgrounds, you'd have thought it rung a few alarm bells with those 3 police authorities. Why on earth are you giving a contract to this company? Anyway, after a few years of badgering, the HMRC did take action. So Nosedive was launched, and it was done in a great style of publicity in 2014, where they actually raided the headquarters in Hartlepool. They found £250,000 in cash under somebody's desk, got lots of documents. And to read the quote from the Teesside Live newspaper at the time, Simon York, Fraud Investigation Service Director of HMRC, said, "This is the culmination of 18 months of painstaking investigations into the suspected systematic abuse of landfill tax systems. We believe that over £78 million of revenue may be involved, money which should have been used to fund some of the UK's most vital public services." Now, that's one operator at £78 million. Now, I thought great when that happened, and I think people I know in the industry thought great when that happened. But then you had a situation, 6 years down the line, someone rang me from, a journalist rang me and said, "Do you know that they've actually dropped Operation Nosedive in the prosecution?" Nothing happened. But they actually spent £3.5 million of public money on the investigation. Now, I tried to find out how much it cost. I know my honourable friend from Bladen tried to find out how much it cost. The only way we got to find out how much it cost, because HMRC wouldn't tell us, was because myself and the Right Honourable for Holton Parson and Howden got the PAC and so the National Audit Office to do an investigation into it. So there is a fundamental question here, and I accept before the Minister tells me that we can't have political control of the HMRC. I agree with that. But their accountability, I'm sorry, is lacking in this situation. The idea that I can't ask, or it's Parliament to ask, why public money is being spent in this way. So that was a complete failure. So they've got away with it in terms of the fraud. That's just £78 million. That's one organisation. The other side to it as well with Miramax as well was they were not the only ones using that landfill site and the other landfill sites that they own. Other operators were actually using those landfill sites. So you do beg the question is who else was in on it? Who were actually paying full landfill tax? And I suspect others were at it as well. I mean, the strange thing about this is one of the main directors of Miramax is currently in prison. Nothing to do with this. It's to do with a very nasty murder case that took place in Hartlepool, which again, were people surprised when he was actually found guilty or been involved in the situation? No, they weren't. But why are people with criminal records being able to run these industries? Because he's making money. And, this is just one case. Yeah.
I'm finding it very educational listening to his speech. Does he share my concern about the prevalence of modern slavery and trafficking in this sector as well? I think in 2018 it was found that 2/3 of modern slavery victims at some point during their period of exploitation ended up in the waste sector. And I think that's very much part of the model that he's talking about, where you've got these cowboy or even criminal elements running it, cutting costs at every corner, and not caring about the cost of human life while they're doing it.
Well, if you look at I'm not suggesting this Miramax case, but the Honourable Lady is right, my Honourable Friend is right, because the individuals that are involved in this are involved in everything from drugs, prostitution, and no doubt modern slavery practices as well. And that's what I just can't get my head round, that the government, whether it be individual departments or as a whole, just turn a blind eye to this, because the damage it's causing. Now we have got promises now that the new waste crime unit, which has been set up, but we'll get this. But again, ask any questions. It's been up and running 3 years now. Has it actually prosecuted anybody yet? No, it has not. So it is a sense of frustration in terms of nosedive, but and also the frustration that HMRC particularly does not seem to think this is important. I'd hate to think actually over the years how many billions, and it is billions of pounds of taxpayers' money, has been lost in terms of this process. And because it falls between HMRC, who don't really seem to be bothered. I remember when I first contacted HMRC about this, they said, well, really, if it's not worth more than £20 million a year, we're not really bothered. Well, I'm sorry, it was £78 million they reckoned Nosedive was worth. And when I asked the parliamentary question of the HMRC whether the individual who was quoted was it his estimate, a private estimate, or was it HMRC, again you get no answer from HMRC because they hide behind this wall of secrecy. And there's a serious issue, I think, to hold these organisations to account. Now, that's Nosedive, but I mean, then the other side to it is the environmental cost. Because the other thing is we've lost revenue, we've obviously funded organised crime, modern slavery and other things, but then there is going to be a cost, and I'm sure three honourable members who are going to speak in this will highlight individual cases in their constituency. There's going to be an environmental clean-up cost to this, and that's going to fall on the taxpayer. Not only is it going to harmful for those various sites, but it will actually end with them. And the fourth point is about what do communities do about this when they get a legal landfill site, or someone who's operating a so-called legal site but is completely ignoring the regulations? Well, it's very frustrating. They feel powerless. And I'm sure later on in this debate we'll have some good examples. I know the Honourable Member for Newcastle-under-Lyne has got some good examples where, even as a parliamentarian, he's raising these things, and not only does he feel powerless, that certainly their constituents do as well. Living next door to piles of rotting waste, worried quite rightly about the environmental effects that these are going to have on their communities. Now, I think the PAC have done fantastic work in terms of highlighting the lack of regulation, but the main thing with it is, has this got any better over since I've been involved? No, it's got worse, I would actually argue, in terms of a lot of good words and sound words, but not a great deal of action. And one of the issues about is enforcement. Now, the Environment Agency, again, another arm's length quango, which, basically hasn't got that enforcement culture what it needs. It mainly uses issuing guidance notes or warning letters. Well, frankly, the type of people you're dealing with here, Sir Roger, it's a waste of giving them guidance notes and actually send them warning letters, is a complete waste of time. So I think, there is a... Now, I did mention the new joint waste crime. I've met them and, credit to them. I think, the individuals are well-meaning and certainly come from an enforcement scope. But unless we actually soon see some prosecutions and real taking down some of the big operators in this, then I think, again, it will just carry on. And I am quite sceptical, frankly, about whether there is a will within, certainly the HMRC, to actually grasp this. Environment Agency has had its budget cuts, and I accept that it's not an enforcement culture. I know one of my old friends referred to them as newt lovers, which possibly they are, but the facts of the matter is I think you've got to have a certain culture to be able to do this. So it is, a bigger problem than as I've actually outlined. And again, it comes back to that point. I can't get my head round. And what it needs now, it needs political lead on this from government to actually grasp this in terms of ensuring that the regulations that are there are enforced, that targets are operated on. Myself, the Honourable Member from Newcastle-under-Lyne and Member for Holton Price, I did meet the National Crime Agency a few months ago to talk about it because, as the Honourable Lady just said, the money that's generated from this is going into a whole host of things, which is costing our society dearly. So, national crime, the new joint waste unit is a step in the right direction, but unless it actually starts delivering, then I think a lot of us will be just sceptical about what's happening. I think the Minister needs to grasp this into the HMRC. There needs to be a focus in government, politically led, with someone who can actually say, right, where are you up to with this, what are you doing, and what is needed. I don't personally think, looking at legislation, people might differ, that it needs more legislation. It just needs existing legislation to be enforced. And this will be not just in terms of ensuring that we have proper waste management and environmental, we don't have environmental devastation through that, but it would also support the existing waste management industry that are playing by the rules. And that is an important point to me. So I raise this debate, and I'm sure my honourable members do as well, with the hope that someone politically in government will finally grasp this one and take it forward, because if it doesn't, I'm sure the members present will not go away. Thank you.
Question is as on the order paper. David Davis.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. As we have come to expect, the right honourable gentleman for North Durham has made his traditional wise, insightful and pretty comprehensive speech. He was right to say we have both struggled to get the government and its agencies to take this issue seriously over the course of, I think it's more than a decade actually. And he's covered the ground thoroughly, but let me see if I can reinforce his points without too much repetition. He spoke of the Public Accounts Committee's estimate of the near £1 billion cost to the Exchequer each year, and he quite rightly referred to it as a finger in the air exercise. I've been a PAC chairman, I know how sometimes they happen. But what it is an underestimate. because we have signals all over the place of how big this really is. The last weekend's Sunday Express talked about £200 million in landfill tax uncollected alone in 2019-2020. Again, an underestimate. It's true, I say as an underestimate, but even HMRC's own figures. And the right honourable gentleman has said pretty plainly, and I agree with him, that HMRC does not want to big this issue up. They do not want to make a big issue, and yet they admit in 5 years we've had at least £850 million of money not collected. It's gone straight into the pockets of some of our most dangerous criminals. And if we had £1 billion not collected, let's say from the bankers or some other such people, it would, and legal people, it would be an uproar. But here we have it not collected from criminals, and it's sort of just going by. As he said, he made the point that it's being funneled into criminal enterprises, and he was quite measured in his language, because the sorts of criminals we're talking about, he sort of referred to them, the Nairamax directors and associate directors. One of them was jailed, as he said, 15 years for manslaughter. And frankly, I was quite surprised it wasn't murder, because it was just this man behaving in a random way over a personal argument and decides to kill the person who's involved. I mean, that's the sort of character we're talking about. Another of his associate directors went to prison first for a machete attack, and then later on for drugs. And this reinforces the point that the right honourable gentleman made, that drugs, prostitution, all of the nasty underbelly of society, all of the nasty criminal activity is funded and supported by the problem we're talking about today. So we need to bear in mind more generally that when we're discussing waste crime, these are not just small-time wheelers and dealers. These are not the sort of steptoes, the Harold Steptoes of today. These are actually very big wheels in criminal terms and very nasty people indeed. And waste crime, of course, has blighted many of our constituencies. Certainly blighted my constituency, Holcombe, Price and Howden, for many years. That's where this concern first came from, in my case, and I think in most cases. Some time ago, in the middle of battles over the Gilberdike site, one of the ones that Nairamax has an interest in my constituency, someone involved in legitimate waste disposal from the southwest of England asked to see me. And since it was such a big and recurrent issue, I said, yes, okay, come and see me. And he came to see me in my home. And he told me a story which, in essence, was this, that the northeast of England is rife with waste crime. It's known for it. That was what he argued to me. He didn't know whether it was an accident of history or whether it's because the Environment Agency was somehow corrupt or involved or whatever, or for whatever reason not doing its job. And to be frank, his story was so extraordinary, I thought it was an exaggeration. This is 5 years or more ago. I thought it was an exaggeration. But I'm sorry to say I was wrong. What he was describing is pretty accurately what we have discovered in our joint endeavours over time. And what that is really is that for too long, the Environment Agency have not been meeting their legal and community obligations, and HMRC have not been enforcing theirs. Now, it must be clear that not all operators in the waste industry are criminal enterprises, anything but. But it's the clear inaction of our agencies that has emboldened the dangerous individuals that do run such criminal enterprises. Now, I will give way to him, yes, of course.
I have to agree with him in terms of not all operators are involved in this sector of criminals. But there is also evidence, in some cases like Miramax and others, that the way in which they procured contracts is once people signed up to them, there were threats and intimidation done afterwards to freeze out legitimate operators and lock people into operating some of these waste crime, people who are perpetrating waste crime.
Yeah, he's right. And I'll come back to the sort of incentives, both criminal and legal, built into this against the legal operator. But he also spoke about the powerlessness of communities, and again I can exemplify that point. We thought we'd have scored a victory by taking the Nairamax Associate Transwaste to court over this Gilberdike site and winning in court. We won that they breached a whole load of conditions. So we won the case. Did my constituents see any improvements? No. Were the problems addressed in court, fixed or enforced by the agency? No. Did the behaviour of the operators improve? No. So the courts proved powerless, and so the community certainly felt powerless. Again, because there was no proper enforcement. It comes back to the point that the right honourable gentleman made when responding to his honourable friend, that this is not primarily about changing the regulation of the law. It's about primarily about changing the mode of operation of the agencies involved. Now, precisely because they cheat, precisely because they evade paying landfill tax, criminal companies can undercut other businesses picking up waste and charging a pittance for it, knowing they'll make up for it in illegal returns. In the case of Gilberdike again, locals reported that lorries were flooding the area from Wembley, South Wales, South West Scotland, Manchester. This is expensive to transport this stuff. Why would you transport it that far unless there is some enormous, unfair, not to say illegal advantage by the operators? That's what's going on there. Some of my constituents, who are very qualified people, monitored that particular site and estimated between 50 and 60 million in landfill tax was being evaded while these lorries were flooding the area. That's one site alone, 50 to 60 million. This involves both the destruction of my constituents' quality of life and the destruction of the local environment. And all being done in pursuit of illegal profits, and yet so little action is being taken. Now, the right honourable gentleman rightly quoted the Public Accounts Committee speaking about the Environment Department in October of last year, when they said, in essence, I'll quote it, "The approach to large parts of waste crime is close to decriminalisation." That, I just make this point, as a past PAC chairman. PAC is very, very careful about what it says about government operations. It's very careful that they're very factually based. It bases everything on the NAO reports and so on. For them to accuse an agency or a department to effectively decriminalise something as serious as this is in itself an enormous statement, enormously powerful and worrying statement. And of course it's a quote that will strike a chord with those of us who've had to observe the appalling weak record of enforcement the Environment Agency has taken, even to legal operators, frankly. I mean, we're not talking about legal operators today, but even with legal operators, I think the Environment Agency is weak, let alone those who really need to be cracked down on. And that fact, again, is reinforced by the data, that the number of prosecutions for waste crime generally, not tax evasion, but waste crime generally, have fallen by more than 90% since 2007, 2008. And of course, as the right honourable gentleman says, no prosecutions whatsoever for landfill tax fraud. And Operation Nosedive, like him, I wondered about the name, where it came from, whether it was making a prediction about its own success, I don't know. But I have to say that its failure was written in from the beginning, frankly. It was a failure from the start. HMRC, the Environment Agency and CPS were simply not working together properly to investigate and prosecute these gangsters. They simply weren't doing the job as a coherent group of people. The NAO told me that HMRC and CPS admitted as much to them, and that's why no prosecutions were taken forward. The problem is this failure and the ongoing increases in the rate of landfill tax means that illegal profits are only increasing. Think about the structure of this. If landfill tax evasion is not stopped, every time landfill tax goes up, in order to improve the environment, it actually incentivises the criminal more and gives the criminals a bigger comparative advantage against the legal, legitimate operators. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, and listening to the story of Nairamax seems to foreshadow so much of my own experience in Newcastle. But I hope the Minister would appreciate this as an economist. Gresham's law says that good money drives out bad money drives out good. Is that not exactly what is happening in the waste sector? That legitimate firms are being driven out of the sector, meaning that there are more and more criminals acting in the sector, making it harder and harder for people to dispose of their waste legitimately, even if they want to.
Yeah, that's correct. That's absolutely correct. And I'm sure Gresham didn't have in mind blackmail and threats as well, which also comes into this when the operation becomes criminal rather than legal. So the joint failure of both HMRC and the Environment Agency has led to theft from the public purse. It is as simple as that. And the devastation of public spaces and the undermining of public confidence in this whole policy area. Ostensibly, the issue is that HMRC is focused on the collection of tax, while the Environment Agency is following a remit to manage waste. That's what the excuse given is, if you like. But frankly, it's extraordinary that the Environment Agency would not collect data on a tax that's designed to incentivise good waste operation. That's the purpose of it. So why on earth is the Environment Agency not actually monitoring that carefully? Because if it's not working, it's a failure of its own remit. I give way.
Right honourable member for giving way, and again I'm finding what he has to say very interesting. And in the past I've asked questions about the Environment Agency's role. It's meant to have a role in enforcing the waste hierarchy, which means things going to landfill should be at the very bottom of that, and it ought to be incentivising recycling, reuse, or not creating waste in the first place. Does he agree with me that we need a fundamental overhaul of that so the Environment Agency is properly resourced and there are incentives and disincentives so that the waste hierarchy is properly observed?
Well, I agree with her in terms of the aims she's describing. But I'm not sure with the Environment Agency, in other areas there is a resource issue, but I'm not sure the Environment Agency is quite such a resource issue. Because if you think about it, if they do their job right first time, that's it dealt with. So to take to bring it down to the microcosm of a single waste tip. And if they don't enforce the first complaint and the second complaint and the third complaint, what will happen is they'll have hundreds and thousands of complaints. And so their time will be sucked into that. So to some extent, there may be a resource issue, but I think a bigger issue here is straightforwardly management, a determination to make the industry obey the rules and to spot things like tax evasion. If tax evasion takes place, the whole structure that she described disappears because the cheap operator who's not paying the taxes gets all the business and therefore nothing is pushed to a better waste outcome. So I take a point, but I think management is in many ways more important. I give way.
On that point though, does the right gentleman agree with me? Is the big disconnect is between the policy which everyone wants to support in terms of trying to get more recycling and not only how it's enforced, but how it's monitored. The best example of that is the Scotland zero waste strategy, which sounds great, but when you actually know that stuff's being shipped across the border into the northeast of England and other sites in the UK, there's no monitoring of that. So exporting waste from Scotland into landfill sites in the UK is not going to meet the environmental standards, which obviously the policy wanted to achieve.
No, I agree. Exporting from Scotland to England, I think he meant, is not going to help at all, and so he's exactly right in that. But we have this ridiculous coordination problem in the midst of all this, and it's the NAO told me that the reason at the end of the day that Nosedive failed was that it was generally felt, there were a variety of reasons, but it was generally felt at the end that the defence for the criminals will be able to exploit all of these weaknesses of coordination, weaknesses of data in this system. And frankly, it's galling that criminal charges could have been held back by the bureaucracy, by the box-ticking approach to what we're talking about here, by government departments effectively stepping on each other's toes rather than working together. Now, waste crime and landfill tax fraud is doing the taxpayer out of hundreds of millions of pounds every year. It's time we got serious about that. Thanks to the NAO, we know that waste crime in general costs, they said 900, the PAC said $1 billion, some very, very large number every single year. We should not lose track of the fact that this is an annual cost 1 billion a year or more. And that's without coming, as it turns out, to the costs in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. We don't have the honourable gentleman here to raise the Northern Ireland point with me, but there too. So in the current climate, I can only imagine the uproar if this occurred anywhere else. Now, the right honourable gentleman touched upon the importance of HMRC's joint unit for waste crime. The government would like to claim it's been a success. Indeed, after the first year, they said it was a success. I have to tell you, I can't see a single sign of success, a single symptom. It's shameful, frankly, and this is why I do agree with the Honourable Lady, who intervened on me earlier, that this is a resource issue, that we do absolutely need to ensure that, unlike the HMRC before, they have the right legal advice at every stage, they have the right data at every stage, they have the right investigative capability at every stage, because then, rather than save 10,000 here and 10,000 there, to lose 3.5 million on a failed case, or $1 billion a year on the system going on, we actually deal with it. It's penny wise, pound foolish is the current strategy, and I think in that respect, she and I would agree on that. So, of course I can wait. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful for him giving way, and he's making an excellent speech. Does he also agree with me that the same principle applies to, on a much smaller scale, admittedly, to local authorities who often are inundated with nuisance fly tipping? I realise this is on a different scale to the issues he's describing, but nevertheless can be very distressing for residents and indeed small businesses across many parts of England.
Yeah, he's right. I mean, it's almost a generic problem with local authorities in many ways, that they are very often faced with problems that look intimidatingly large to them. And the temptation always is to penny pinch, just to spend just a little bit of money to see if they can stop it, and fail, and the problem invariably grows. And we see this time and time again, and particularly in this area, and he's absolutely right. And I think, following on from this, I mean, people will also, it's a separate issue really, but fly tipping concerns about fly tipping amongst the public are as great as they are about waste crime generally. And I think he's dead right. And my advice to local authorities is always try and nip this in the bud, because if you get seen as being a weak responder, then the crime will come to you. That's what will happen. If you get seen as a weak responder, the crime will come to you. So, yes, of course.
I wasn't seeking to be overly critical of the local authorities. I was trying to illustrate the wider point in terms of government funding for them and some of their powers as well, indeed. So we've had an issue with waste on many plots of land within the areas I represent, and also some bits deposited by people who are just passing through. But the powers also seem to be a real challenge for local authorities. Perhaps he would want to say something about that.
He's reaching beyond my level of expertise on this, frankly, but my view is this is clearly a systemic problem, and either there's a funding shortage, or there is a power shortage, a resource, a capability shortage, better way of putting it, and one or the other needs to be corrected, because the current system is not working. I mean, anybody who lives in a rural area in particular will see this. It's a permanent running nightmare, a running sore, which we have to deal with. So systemically, I agree with him, basically. Now, it's not just lack of funding or lack of joined-up government in coming back to the waste crime issue. It's also a lack of understanding of the problem. Now, the NAO found that DEFRA and the Environment Agency are simply not collecting the data. They need to fully realise the extent of waste crime across the board. The NAO said, and I quote, "The waste crime data they are currently collecting do not give an accurate picture of actual incidents of waste crime because of underreporting." This comes back to the finger in the air guess that the £1 billion is, because it's obviously bigger than that, because the money the issue is being undermeasured too much. And I can't see how our agencies are going to get a grip of the problem if they don't even measure the size of it. When I told one of my constituents about this debate, he told me how little faith he has in the Environment Agency, and frankly I share his concerns. And literally before I came in here, sitting just outside talking to colleagues, Mr Deputy Speaker, 4 colleagues in a row, every single one of them said, yeah, we have the same problems. You know, they're not here today, they're off back to their constituencies, but they all have the same problems. It's a systemic problem that comes back time and again. So for too long, waste crime has gone unnoticed by the Environment Agency's officers, which begs the question, What's going on? Are they indolent? Are they incompetent? Or are they involved or been bribed? No. The simple truth is they do not have the tools they need to do the job. We've created a system where our agencies are prevented from acting for fear of that action making the problem worse. If they're looking at a company and they want to take action on it, they are terrified that if they bankrupt the company, they will suddenly be left with the taxpayer having to fund the clean-up. So they'll either not have a clean-up or they're going to have to find millions upon millions of pounds. They're worried, and none of that needs to happen. So in summary, is what's needed on this alone is we need to make sure that the warrants, the reserves required in the balance sheets of new waste operators are big enough to actually cover the costs of a clean-up in the event that they go bankrupt. Whether that's an insurance system or a reserve system or a warranty system, I don't know, but it's got to be something like 10 times as big as what we currently have. The new Joint Waste Crime Unit needs to have dedicated funding from central government of sufficient size to do what we've seen. We actually have a perfect environment. We've had the failure of Nosedive. We can see all the points of failure. Unusually for HMRC, they are identified in the public domain, so we can design what is required for the joint unit. And we need the Environment Agency to get out on the ground and collect the data they need to help HMRC prosecute these gangsters. And we need to ensure that they're all getting proper legal advice. One of the reasons Nosedive failed was, I think if I remember correctly, 3 different lawyers given to them by CPS over time, and eventually when they actually hired a private lawyer, they got proper advice and they decided they couldn't pursue it. You know, that is saving tens of thousands to lose 3.5 million to lose billions. That's penny wise, pound foolish. And you know, if the government thinks this costs too much, just think of the consequence of failure here. So when the Minister sums up, I appreciate he won't be able to give instant answers today, but I'll ask him to do this. I'll ask him to go back to his department and simply ask why not. The Right Honourable Gentleman and I have proposed a variety of issues which will pay for themselves 1,000 times over. So why not? Why not take the action necessary? Why not save the taxpayer money, but more important than all, save our constituents from the disasters these people visit on us?
Mr. Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And first of all, can I congratulate my Right Honourable friend, the Member for North Durham, and the Right Honourable Member for Hulton, Price and Howden for securing this debate and for their commitment in exposing this issue over the last decade. Let's start by stating the obvious. Living near a landfill site is not pleasant. In fact, it's very unpleasant. No one wants to do it. And I think our ultimate aim must be, through that waste hierarchy, to ensure that we do away with landfill sites in the future. That's the first point. But mismanagement of landfill sites which do exist is an issue which has affected my constituents in Blaydon a great deal over many years. In 2019, in fact, I brought an adjournment to this House to raise the issue of Blaydon Quarry landfill site, which was then located in the village of Greenside and surrounded by the communities of Winlayton, Barlow, Stargate, Ryton and Blaydon Burn. Now, the site was thankfully closed to waste deposits in September 2021, but not before these proud former mining communities had endured years of foul odours and litter and dust from the site scattered over our fields and trees. It would be a challenge, actually, to overstate the sheer amount of correspondence that I and my predecessor received about the site and the persistent upset caused to communities who were unable to enjoy and take pride in the very beautiful environment surrounding the site. Now, before the site's closure, multiple enforcement notices concerning management of the site had been given following repeated breaches of regulations on planning and environmental grounds. A particularly nasty breach in 2015 involved a huge escape of litter from the site during a period of high winds, which amounted to nothing less than environmental vandalism. Despite the scale of the devastation, the Environment Agency legal team told us that it wasn't going to be possible to make a prosecution because of that. And this is a pattern that we saw several times over the years. And I should say at this stage that I can only thank the Environment Agency officers who worked in my constituency on my sites for the great efforts they had, pushed continually by the community and by ourselves for their efforts. But still, no prosecutions. Now, the site has had a number of operators. Most recently, we've seen Octagon Green Solutions, and previously Nairamax, and before that, Premier Waste. A number of operators, all with different problems. In 2015, our local newspapers and broadcast media had huge coverage of the HMRC instigated and coordinated raids on a number of sites across the North East, including the Bladen landfill site, as part of that ill-fated Operation Nosedive, a raid that involved 180 HMRC officers and many others, which was widely publicised, trumpeted even across the region, with HMRC estimating an alleged fraud of £78 million. I was just reviewing some of the media reporting on it as I prepared for today, and everyone was there in full gear. There were photos from the site, there were television reports, all of this produced by HMRC trumpeting this great investigation. And I have to say that it was welcomed, different from the environmental issues, but welcomed by people in the community who were fed up with the operation of these sites. Now, given the damage that these companies had inflicted on our local communities, my constituents took great interest in Operation Nosedive and didn't forget about it over the years. And they took great interest in that alleged and potential landfill tax fraud. They continued to write to me throughout the whole period to inquire about the outcome of the investigation, until HMRC quietly, very quietly, slipped out the news that Operation Nosedive had not resulted in any prosecutions after 6.5 years, and what we now know was £3.5 million of public costs. These families invested faith in HMRC to bring about justice, and having worked fastidiously with our local landfill liaison committee, Gateshead Council, the Environment Agency, to hold the companies to account on waste management issues, we hoped that HMRC's lengthy criminal investigation would deliver on the issue of alleged financial crime if it is found. But we have just heard that 6.5 years produced nothing at a huge cost. Now, when HMRC revealed that no prosecutions would be brought after that time, I wrote to the Chief Executive of HMRC twice, asking for an explanation. I was told this couldn't be given, and neither would there be any clarification on whether civil action would be taken. So I wrote to them, first of all, in April. The response was, unfortunately, I am unable to provide details of the costs incurred in this specific operation, as HMRC does not report the costs of individual cases. I wrote back on this and a number of other issues around the failed action. And again, as per my response dated the 30th of April 21, I am unable to provide details of the costs incurred in this specific operation, as HMRC does not report the costs of individual cases. I hope this helps you to respond to your constituents' enquiries and explain why we are unable to provide more details. Well, frankly, no, it didn't. It didn't help me at all. And so can I really congratulate the two honourable members today for North Durham and Halton Price and Howden on proceeding with their efforts to get this issue investigated and to reveal the true costs. This is public money. It's taxpayers' money, and people are entitled to know what has happened to it and why this 6.5-year operation has failed. I think we're now clearer as we've just heard, about what happened, that lack of coordination that lack of joint work. But frankly, it's just not good enough for my constituents. So I'm pleased that the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee have looked at this and reported on the financial aspect of Operation Nosedive. But it remains absolutely vital that the government takes decisive action to address the issues that it raises. We've got to take the necessary steps to tackle the ongoing abuse of the landfill tax system and other waste crime as well, which is estimated by the Environmental Services Association to have cost the taxpayer about £120 million in 2021. I will.
Very thankful for my friend. I know she's been pursuing this for many years. We've had lots of discussions as my parliamentary neighbour. But would she also say that her community is also worried for the future? Because although the site she refers to, I know well, is now closed and possibly the initial blowing rubbish, etc., stopped, because we actually don't know what's actually in that site, there could be a ticking time bomb in terms of environmental damage. And ultimately, if it has to get cleaned up, it'll come back to the taxpayer to do it.
Well, I most certainly do agree with my honourable friend on that issue. And of course, we already have a history of sites in previous years that we have no idea what's in them. So it's absolutely vital that we do know what is in those sites, and vital that the efforts are made to ensure that action is taken to make sure that landfill operators behave responsibly. I hesitated by saying responsibly. They need to behave in accordance with the law, and they need to treat the waste properly and respect their local communities and our environment. So, as I was saying, I'm pleased too to see that the Public Accounts Committee published their report on waste crime in October 2022, and the government acknowledged slow progress in their response on the wider issues of waste crime. And now, I believe, we were awaiting the outcome of the landfill tax call for evidence that we haven't yet seen. Of particular concern are reports of serious and organised crime in the waste sector. The establishment of the Joint Unit for Waste Crime in 2020 suggests progress on this issue, and we've heard reassurances that the unit will promote coordination between HMRC and the Environment Agency and other bodies. And I'm glad to hear that, that members have been able to speak to and meet that. And I'm sure that they will, and certainly I will be keeping an eye on the progress of that. So that's a positive move, but this coordination would go some way to remedy the difficulties in discharging responsibilities between the different bodies that have been held responsible for the failure of Operation Nosedive. But the National Audit Office reported in April 22 that the unit does not receive any dedicated funding from government, and that the Environment Agency's previously ring-fenced funding for waste crime will be incorporated into its core funding from 2022 to 2023. And furthermore, the report highlights the need for improved data on waste crime, as we have heard, so that resources can be targeted more effectively and progress more accurately assessed. It's vitally important that the resources are available in the future to make that coordinating work very effective and to protect communities. Finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, if we're to learn the lessons of the failure of Operation Nosedive, and I just can't imagine who thought up that name, because it's been so, in itself it's caused a lot of issues. But if we're to learn those lessons of Operation Nosedive and make a difference, then the government must establish a more stable footing for the investigations. Our environment is precious to local communities, and waste management is a vital part of its preservation. It must not be placed in the hands of criminals or fraudsters and must be managed to the highest standards.
Annabelle.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady for Blaydon, whose constituents experience many of the same problems mine have, albeit a few years before, and also to speak following the two excellent contributions from my right honourable friends, the members for North Durham and Halton Price and Howden. Very pleased to go with them to the National Crime Agency last year and try and get these issues taken more seriously. I pay tribute to all three members who've spoken today have done over the years before I was a member of this place in trying to get this issue taken more seriously, because it is a really serious issue. It's not just the cost to the public purse, which has been spoken about many times already, but it's the cost to our constituents and the cost to their lives, their health, their physical health and their mental health. And that's what people in Newcastle-under-Lyme have been suffering, as I've brought repeatedly to the House's attention over many years. And the failure of these investigations, the failure of the ill-named nosedive, only emboldens the people in this space. The firm that operates Wally's Quarry, Red Industries Limited, had a failed prosecution against them for a separate site of theirs by the Environment Agency over an incident in which cyanide leaked into the River Trent in October 2009. After many years, the Environment Agency conceded the flaws in their case, which were again probably caused by insufficiently advanced legal advice, which the Right Honourable Gentleman opposite referred to. And that only emboldened the firm. And you can see that if you go back and look at the press releases, crowing over the failure of the EA's prosecution of them back then. That only emboldened them to think that they can get away with things, that they won't be held to account by the people who should be holding them to account. So we really need to learn all the lessons of nosedive, of that incident in the Trent, and all the other occasions where we have failed to prosecute landfill tax fraud or other forms of waste crime. And the fact there hasn't been a successful ever conviction for landfill tax fraud is absolutely astounding when you consider the depth of criminality that we have exposed in the waste industry. And I exposed some of it myself in the Westminster Hall debate I led last year on the 1st of February, which both of the honourable gentlemen spoken and referred to in their speeches. If I can just briefly update the House on where we are with Wally's Quarry, because it's germane to the debate, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm not going to repeat the full history, having already had adjournment debates and multiple Westminster Hall debates and the 10-minute rule bill and all the rest of it. But what I would say is that what my right honourable friend said about the Environment Agency's fear that action might actually make the problem worse is well-founded, I think, because firstly, they've done monitoring in the past and they said nothing to see here. They were very reluctant to do further monitoring until eventually they were forced into it by a combination of myself and the council leader, Simon Tagg. And once they did concede there was a problem, the idea that we might take the permit away from these people who continually failed was barely even discussed, because they wanted to make sure that the company managed the site. And I understand that, as a strategy. But it's a strategy that really sticks in the craw of all the local residents who can see what's happening. They can see the trucks coming from hundreds of miles away, from Scotland, from the Lake District, to bring waste to Wally's Quarry. They're monitoring them. They're monitoring them going in at the wrong times of the day, dumping before they're supposed to. So many little breaches along the way that sticks in the craw of people that they know the site is under investigation, and yet the company is continuing to make money from their operations. I know how painful that is for my constituents who are actually suffering, or have suffered, with living with the odour, because Wally's Quarry is particularly notorious for its odour. We've had by far the single worst odour problem in recorded history. I think the previous record belonged to Mr Speaker himself in Chorley, but our site has broken all records. Our site has broken all records. We had 4 of the Environment Agency's monitoring stations ringed around the site for the last couple of years. What I am pleased to report to the House is that the odour is diminishing, and that is because of the work the Environment Agency has compelled the operators to do. So as far as it goes, that strategy is fine. But the second part of that strategy needs to be throwing the book at the operator, because they've issued them multiple breaches over the last few years, and all of those breaches require them to do work and then say we will reserve the right to take further punishment action later. And we are waiting for that punishment action to happen. In fact, we've got 2 investigations going on in Newcastle-under-Lyme and to Wally's Quarry. There's a criminal investigation which was announced in December 21. I understand that's ongoing. I understand that will take a long time. It's very complex. There are lots of counterparties involved. It's all about misdescription of waste, which is a much wider problem and a much wider investigation for the EA as well. But there's also the regulatory investigation, which they announced in September. I raised with the Secretary of State at DEFRA questions shortly before Christmas. We need to get some results on that more quickly than that, because this is regulation. This is what the EA's bread and butter should be. They need to start holding them to account for the failures. But I would say the odour problem has been getting better. We're capturing nearly over twice as much gas as we were. We've got those figures there. The EA have mandated capping in additional wells. It's not to say it never smells. It did smell a bit in December, particularly when the temperature fell below 0. Those are the conditions where the odour gets a lot worse. I'd also like to put on record my congratulations to Newcastle-under-Lyme Borough Council under the leadership of Councillor Tagg and the Chief Executive Martin Hamilton, who took the very bold step, almost unprecedented for a local authority, of pursuing an abatement notice against the operator. It's very difficult to do that, because if you wish to prosecute that abatement notice, you'll need the consent of the Secretary of State, because it's a regulated site and they have the permit with the EA. But the impact on our residents in Newcastle was so severe, they felt they had to do that, and they were able to actually bring that to successful conclusion with the operator, who initially appealed but ultimately accepted it after after some consultation and discussion. And that is actually the first proper concession, I think, that Wally's Quarry Limited and Red Industries, their parent company, have made, that their site has been responsible for the unacceptable odour. So we do need to get those investigations pursued with all deliberate speed. I'm grateful to the EA for giving me a briefing on Monday on them, but I appreciate the Minister is a Treasury Minister, not a DEFRA Minister, but we do need to see all pressure potentially put on the Environment Agency to get those investigations brought to a conclusion as soon as possible, so my constituents can start to see some justice, some accountability, potentially some compensation, whether that's through government or through the class action lawsuit that I know a number of them are considering, because of the impact on people's quality of lives, on people's health conditions, exacerbating pre-existing conditions like COPD and asthma, exacerbating pre-existing mental health conditions of anxiety and depression, has been absolutely phenomenal. And I laid that all out when I had the adjournment debate, so I won't do again today. But even in the most recent month, there's been more breaches of the permit. I do apologise, yes.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for letting me, for giving way briefly. Does he want to say a little bit about the disruption and the concern caused by heavy vehicle movements near these sites? This is something which around the country is a huge concern. And in our area, we recently had planning permission granted for an incinerator in West Berkshire, but the road access is likely to be through Reading Town Centre, and many of my residents are very concerned about this. And I'd be interested to learn from him how his own colleagues have helped to tackle this problem in Staffordshire.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman very much for his intervention. And that has actually been a very significant problem in Newcastle as well. There have been accidents on the road outside the landfill caused by lorries backing up along that road. The firms opposite have complained about access to their businesses, people getting into those businesses. There's been an arrangement made recently through a variation to the planning permission to allow vehicles on the site before the 7 a.m. opening, so they can queue at least on the site rather than on the road. Also the state of the road, the mud that some vehicles have left on that, when there's a wheel wash that vehicles are supposed to go through when they leave, it's clear it hasn't always been working. The county council has had to write on more than one occasion to the operator demanding that they clean up the local roads as well. The traffic issues and the state of the roads are absolutely significant, and I wish him well in his efforts to represent the people of Reading in the case he refers to with the incinerator. The impact is not just the odour, it's the whole operation and the way it interferes with people's quality of life in the surrounding villages. I was just saying before the intervention that there have been far too many breaches still going, even under the intense scrutiny that this operator has been under. As I say, 4 monitoring stations, regular Environment Agency visits, including unannounced visits, which I welcome, and yet they are still being found responsible for more and more breaches. I'd like to pay tribute particularly to the Stop the Stink campaigner, Dr Mick Salt, who's brought a number of these to the public's attention through freedom of information requests. The continual failure of this operator to comply with the conditions of the permit, even under this intense scrutiny, is absolutely staggering, and it surely only strengthens the case for them being stripped of the permit altogether when that moment comes, when we get the conclusion of the investigation. And I will, of course, continue to fight for my constituents, ensuring the operator and the EA are both fully held to account, and we get some appropriate action in response to the misery that this landfill has visited on the residents of Newcastle-under-Lyme, particularly the people living closest to it. Turning more specifically to today's debate about landfill tax fraud, I did raise this in the Westminster Hall debate last February, I referred to, and as I said in my intervention on my right honourable friend, this is a problem where bad firms are driving good ones out of the industry. I've spoken to legitimate operators in Stoke-on-Trent who are upset with the fact that they are trying to do an honest job and they can't compete with firms that are undercutting them on this, because fundamentally most people are going to take assurances from firms. Oh, of course we handle your waste legitimately, don't worry about that. But here's a nice price for you. And a lot of firms are going to be guided by that. That's where regulation needs to step in. That's where people need to have confidence that a regulated firm will be regulated. So therefore, they've got no incentive to go to one or the other because of an ethical consideration. They need to be able to trust that any firm in a regulated space is operating honestly and is operating ethically. As we heard in the opening speech, landfill tax, the differential is now up to over £95 per tonne. When the charge was first introduced in 1996, there was only a £5 a tonne differential between the two rates, £2 to £7. And whilst I welcome that landfill tax has reduced the overall amount of waste going to landfill, it has obviously created this incentive. And it's also created a stronger incentive that waste that shouldn't be going into landfill at all is going into landfill. It's not merely misdescription of standard waste as inert, but there's things that shouldn't be going into landfill at all. And in that debate last February, There were examples that were evidenced by a journalist doing the research of cavity wax, arsenic, zinc and even rat poison going into Wally's quarry. I know those allegations have been put to the Environment Agency. They'll be part of the criminal investigation, I'm sure. I don't want to comment further on them today. But the problem here is misdescription of waste is increasingly incentivised when you're charging £100 a tonne for what you're putting in. Yes, of course.
So agree with me is that what ever seems to amaze me is that when the Environment Agency understand there's a problem, and I refer to fires at waste transfer stations and landfill sites, which I did ask, I was trying to rack my brains to think what the figure was, but this is another way of operators want to get around the regulations by getting rid of waste, by burning it. This is a common practice which the Environment Agency just seem to have turned a blind eye to. And that's not only just the effect into the environment of that burning what you shouldn't be burning, but also avoiding landfill tax.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, the right honourable gentleman. It's particularly in relation to illegal waste sites. You can almost rely on the fact that sooner or later there'll be a suspicious arson attack on that illegal landfill site. And actually often it's getting the fire service involved in these problems that is the quickest way to getting them resolved, because they know it's ultimately them that are going to be involved in the clean-up rather than the Environment Agency. I have a notorious illegal waste dump in my constituency as well, which I won't detain the House with too long, but at Doddles Pool Farm we've seen all of this sort of thing going on, and we've also seen all sorts of impacts on the environment there with vermin and all the rest of it. There's also fly tipping itself, which is probably forecast to have the greatest overall financial impact, though it's very difficult to get the numbers in. So when we talk about the tax gap that we have talked about, the national tax gap for HMRC overall was estimated to be about 5.1%, but in landfill tax it's 17.1% for 2020-21. It's been over 20% in the years before that. That's equivalent to £125 million, only part of the overall £1 billion estimate of the cost of waste crime. We're not even really taking into account the cost of fly tipping in that. We're talking about tax that shouldn't have been collected that hasn't been. When you're starting to deal with things that are completely illegal, they fall somewhat outside the tax gap calculations, as I understand it. The honourable member for the... yes, of course.
Before he leaves the question of the perverse incentive, I mean, this, as far as I'm aware, and I served, as I say, for 5 years as Public Accounting Chairman, this, as far as I'm aware, is the clearest example of a strong incentive for good policy turning into a strong perverse incentive against that good policy off the back of enforcement.
Yes.
And so when the Treasury assesses how much it puts into enforcement, it ought to take that full spectrum of effect into account. Does he agree?
I couldn't agree more, and I will be coming to that. And as I think I can't remember which one of the honourable gentleman it was earlier that said that, but earlier about the Environment Agency, there's been a cultural problem with enforcement, and I would like to see HMRC step up and assist, basically. And I'll come to that in my conclusion, that there's a long tradition of the taxman being the man who actually catches organised and serious crime in the end. It's not happening in waste crime in this country. We need to start seeing that. But I'll come to that a little bit more in future. Just referring to that Public Accounts Committee, the statement the Honourable Member of the Cotswolds gave on the 18th report, Jim Harrow had assured the Public Accounts Committee that the tax gap being this large was because the scope of landfill tax had been widened to include illegal waste sites. But if we took fly tipping into account, it might be even larger, because the summary of that report stated, quotes, waste crime is known to be greatly underreported, so the true scale and impact of the problem are even larger than official data suggest. And as my right honourable friend just said, that's just the financial cost. We're not remotely taking into account the cost and the impact on people's quality of life. And perhaps if we do get a class action lawsuit, we might get some financial numbers that are attributed to that in Newcastle-under-Lyme.
Tax gap, which I think some actions belatedly being taken. That's the export of waste as well, which not only avoids tax, but actually where it goes to in some developing countries causes an environmental disaster for those countries.
Yes, my honourable gentleman is absolutely correct. And indeed, one of the issues we've seen at Wally's Quarry that I alluded to last February was the suggestion that waste that should have been exported for treatment in I believe the Netherlands was actually going straight into the landfill as well. So export adds an extra layer of complexity, an extra layer for the Environment Agency and HMRC to get on top of. But get on top of it they must, because these operators are using all the tricks in the book to get their waste dealt with as cheaply as possible and maximise their profits, as we've discussed. And it is misclassified waste on the social cost that, according to the Environment Agency, that is the most likely result of the smell Wallis Quarry landfill. It's driven primarily by the hydrogen sulphide created by the biodegradation of gypsum. And that awful impact is what's been experienced by my constituents time and time again. And it was exacerbated, I think, by the fact we were in lockdown when this was at its worst. But it also meant that when we opened up again, people didn't want to come out into the town centre, use our pubs, bars, cafes, or even just shopping generally because of the awful odour. And I've talked also about the health impacts. There's also the long-term environmental unknown risks of things going into landfills. We don't know exactly what is in Wallis Quarry. If the reports from the journalists are to be believed, there could be all sorts of things in there. I have had assurances that given it's all capped off, it's very unlikely to cause any risk. But not knowing what is in the ground is not a great state of affairs for a site that should have been properly regulated ever since the permission was granted by John Prescott back in 1998. Coming to a conclusion, because I'm conscious I've spoken for a while, Mr Deputy Speaker, we need to look at what is being done, but what more needs to be done. The Public Accounts Committee report I referenced earlier set out that action is being taken, but it is, I believe, being too slow to implement. We've seen the joint waste crime unit set up, but we haven't seen enough activity off the back of that. We've seen the helpful reports from the NAO that highlighting the severity of the problem. I do understand the government accepted all the recommendations of that report and is going to implement them all. We do need to see a response to the landfill, the HMRC landfill tax call for evidence. We don't know what's going to happen with that yet, but it needs to be structured in such a way that it achieves its legitimate aims of reducing waste going to landfill, but doesn't incentivise people to take shortcuts. And obviously, DEFRA, the EA and HMRC need to work with relevant bodies within the criminal justice system to develop a plan for making enforcement more effective across the full spectrum of waste crime. And this includes speeding the process up and, very importantly, consideration of whether the sentencing guidance needs strengthening. Because I think the inadequacy of the fines for companies, the fines for individuals is all too apparent. That you see people doing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of damage, not even allowing for the social costs, and only being hit with hundreds or thousands of pounds worth of fines. Very few cases where people go to prison. And on top of that, we also need to look at whether the bonds that operators are putting up are sufficient, because that is precisely why the Environment Agency are worried about operators walking away, because they know the money that's been put up in a bond will not be sufficient for the local authority to ameliorate that site. And that's exactly the discussion we have had in Staffordshire about what would happen if the operator did walk away from Wallis Quarry. Who would be on the hook for that? How would we manage it? And I pay tribute to the work that councils have done to prepare for that potential eventuality, but it shouldn't have to be like that. There should be enough money in the bond that we know we could fund it and we could work for it if necessary. It is clear from my many discussions with the Environment Agency, many of their officers agree that there is fundamentally a lack of deterrence here. I'm critical of their culture, and I think they were far too slow to react when the problem got worse, but there is also a feeling that people are getting away with it because they don't feel deterred by the sanctions. So I think that we do need to look at that as well. We need to see much tougher fines, the prospect of lengthy prison terms, and there does need to be a fit and proper person test for people seeking to operate landfills, whether they're setting one up or whether they're taking over a licence. All the agencies need to work together to deter waste crime and landfill tax. Now, I've often spoken to DEFRA ministers about this, and I appreciate today we have the Treasury here because it's an HMRC issue. I do look forward to what the Minister has to say on these matters that will go towards tackling landfill tax fraud and waste crime more generally effectively. I know some of HMRC's caseload may look like there's more to be gained by working elsewhere, but I do think we are losing out on hundreds of millions of pounds of tax, but also millions and billions of pounds of social costs on top of that. And there's an incalculable loss that we can't trust this sector. And ordinary people who want to dispose of their waste can't trust the sector because they don't know whether they're giving their waste to someone who's going to dispose of it legally or illegally. Some very blue-chip names disposed of their waste at Wallis Quarry and were appalled to find themselves identified as having done that by the reporting of the journalists and subsequently stopped sending it there. No blame attaches to them necessarily, but that shows that the sector cannot overall be trusted. And as I said earlier, there is a tradition of the taxman being the one who finally holds serious organised criminals to account. It goes back to Al Capone and all the rest of it. What I'd ask from the Minister is that HMRC step up and give the Environment Agency a helping hand, because the crimes that the Treasury has on the statute, but the HMRC can charge people with, are much more serious than have much more serious consequences in terms of financial consequences and potentially punitive criminal jail time for people. And if the HMRC could learn the lessons from Nosedive and start to look to prosecute people for waste crime, that would be greatly appreciated both by me, my constituents, and I'm sure the constituents of all honourable members here today.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and let me congratulate both my honourable friend, the honourable member for North Durham, and the right honourable member for Alton Price and Howden. They make a formidable partnership on this. I suspect they have been talking about it for quite a long time. My honourable friend from North Durham described himself as an anorak at the beginning. I would say he's just very persistent and determined and should keep on going. We've had very well-informed and passionate contributions from all those who have spoken in this debate so far. My honourable friend from Blaydon outlining the problems that her constituents have faced over many, many years through the unfortunately named Operation Nosedive. And I would say to the honourable member for Newcastle under Lyme, the Shadow Deputy team are well aware of the dismal saga that goes on at Wally's Quarry. I suspect there's a considerable amount of agreement on both sides of the chamber on these issues. I'm sure you will be disappointed to hear I'm duty-bound to reprise some of the arguments that have been already made. But I would just gently say to members opposite that although it's not in my remit to defend the Environment Agency, if you do cut an agency's funding by half over the last decade, there probably are some consequences inevitably. And while it's not just a question of resource, I think that might have played a part in it. But the subject of the debate, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the issue of landfill tax fraud, which is a blight on our communities across the country, causing lasting damage to the environment and, of course, depriving the Exchequer of revenue. Back in 1996, and I remember, I think I was a councillor at the time, it was much talked about and I think in many ways seen as an innovative policy instrument, the aim being to divert waste away from landfill towards more environmentally friendly management options, including recycling, reuse and recovery. But right from the beginning, there were specific issues identified as possibly of concern, one being the potential cost to local authorities, but also the impact of the tax on fly tipping and this whole issue of perverse unintended consequences. And I have to say, my time in the House, the one thing that struck me over the last 7 years is our ability to make legislation but then completely fail to follow through with the enforcement, which is a source, I suspect, of endless frustration to us, but much more importantly to our constituents. Clearly, the issues we're discussing today are not a new phenomenon. According to the Office of National Statistics, while this tax has had a positive effect of a 65% reduction, and I emphasise in recorded waste reaching landfill sites between 1997 and 2014, it's pretty clear that the regulatory framework needed to protect those positive environmental objectives has been both piecemeal and slow and unable to react to the changing circumstances. In October 2021, the Environment Agency estimated that waste crime costs the English economy more than £900 million a year alone, with their 2021 National Waste Crime Survey describing waste crime in England as endemic. And as we've heard, it's also, of course, associated with other criminal acts, including offences against persons. I want to just briefly quote a traumatic account referred to by the Environment Agency's Chief Executive last year from an anonymous victim, and what they said was, last Wednesday they invaded our home, a peaceful night shattered by the roar of engines and the glare of headlights. I opened the front door and was confronted by a large group of men who declared they now lived here. We were harassed, our safe was smashed, our keys were stolen and a new lock put on the gate trapping us. They dumped piles of waste and trash. We were threatened, I'll smash your face in. By midday they were gone, leaving behind tons of rubbish, boasting it would cost £50,000 to remove. And I mean, that shocking victim's account not only demonstrates just how unpleasant these people are, but the lengths that some criminals will resort to. And illegal methods of evasion include the misdescription of waste, the operation of illegal waste sites, burning and burying of waste, fly tipping, illegal exports, offences relating to producer responsibility obligations, and abuse of exemptions to the requirements for waste permits, to name just a few. And in a response to a Treasury call for evidence last year, the misclassification of waste was described by the Chartered Institution of Waste Management as an environmental catastrophe waiting to happen. And as we've heard, that the differential between the lower and standard rate of tax was a massive incentive to misclassify waste. And according to HMRC's most recent annual estimate of the tax gap, the gap between landfill tax due in tax year 2020-21, as we've heard, and revenue collected in the same year is that staggering £125 million, a gap of 17.1%, much, much higher than the overall tax gap for this year. And according to HMRC's own report, the uncertainty rating for the landfill tax gap estimate is high. And again, as has been said, it's therefore reasonable to conclude that the actual tax gap is even greater. And there are other things that could have been included, including fly tipping, and it's reported by local authorities to have risen year on year to more than 1.13 million incidents reported in 2020-21, an increase of 16% from 2019-20, according to the Office of National Statistics. So I'd say to the Minister, to get a sense of the real scale of the problem, can the Minister indicate whether the Government has any plans to include other categories of tax fraud into future estimations of the landfill tax gap? And in terms of that 125 million tax gap identified in 2021, could the Minister tell the House exactly how much of this due tax has actually been recovered by HMRC and what resources they are allocating specifically for its recovery? Now, we heard earlier about the Joint Unit for Waste Crime, which brings together law enforcement agencies, environmental regulators, HMRC, the National Crime Agency. But the NAO has suggested the government still does not have the data it requires to assess the true scale of waste crime. And the NAO reported that 60 organised crime groups monitored by the Joint Unit for Waste Crime have extensive involvement in other types of crime, 70% involved in specialist money laundering, which, as we've heard, I've raised particularly by my friend, my honourable friend, the member for North Durham. So given the scale of the tax evasion, it would be very helpful if the government could tell us about the actions being taken to address the prevalence of money laundering and to publish specific revenue recovery figures and detail the number of investigations being undertaken. So frankly, Mr Deputy Speaker, the government really needs to get a grip on this. And as we've heard again, last year the Public Accounts Committee report concluded the regulatory regime for waste crime is considered to be close to decriminalisation, as the Right Honourable Gentleman reported earlier, with fines seen as a mere business expense for waste criminals. And that report went on to outline that over recent years, the landfill tax regime has increased the incentive, again as we've heard, to commit waste crime. That's a strong charge, with HMRC being too slow to prosecute offenders and highlighting the lack of a deterrence posed by the current sanctions regime and rate of prosecution. And as confirmed by the committee and in response to written questions to my honourable friend, the member for North Durham, it's extraordinary it still has not been that single successful prosecution into landfill tax fraud. And of course, we've heard about the huge amounts of money, the huge staggering costs to the public purse of Operation Nosedive. And we've heard also about the fact that sanctions are not nearly enough, not nearly punitive enough to be a real deterrence against future offending. According to findings from the National Audit Office in 2022, the most common action, and again the Right Honourable Gentleman mentioned this, the most common action taken is to issue advice and guidance. And I think I rather share his view about how likely that would be to be effective. Advice and guidance in 52% of cases, warning letters no less to 37%, hardly likely to be a major deterrent to some of the criminal operations we've been hearing about. So it's really important that all relevant government agencies work together to develop a proper plan for making enforcement more effective. And the committee recommended that DEFRA work with the Treasury and HMRC to ensure the ongoing review of landfill tax takes account of the incentives that the tax, as currently designed, creates to commit waste crime. And we heard reference from a number, including my friend from Bladen, about the Treasury minutes from December 2022, confirming that the government largely agrees with this recommendation and highlights that as part of its review into landfill tax, it will consider the structure. And I'd be very grateful if the Minister could confirm that this is the case. So in conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, the government needs to do much more to get a grip on this waste crime endemic and ensure that the tax system does not lose revenue to criminality and deception. Frankly, at a time when working people are facing the highest tax burden in 70 years, the government needs to urgently close the tax gap and reclaim the missing revenues owed to the Exchequer by those engaged in landfill tax fraud. Waste crime lays waste to the environment and damages people's lives. It makes it much more difficult for legitimate operators working in the waste sector, whilst at the same time undermining investment, jobs and growth. As on so many other issues, it's time for DEFRA in particular and the government in general to get a grip.
Minister.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a real privilege to respond to today's Backbench Business Debate, and of course I congratulate the Right Honourable Gentleman for North Durham, my right honourable friend for Halton, Price and Howden for calling this debate. I've only responded to one of these Backbench Business Debates before, and it was when I was a Justice Minister, and sure enough, one of the proponents was my right honourable friend for Halton, Price and Howden. It was on the subject of SLAP, so he does cover a diverse range of issues, but it's a credit to him. As my regional neighbour, as it were, the shadow Labour spokesman said, he referred to the fact that the right honourable member for North Durham had called himself an anorak on this subject, but I actually agree on this matter with the honourable gentleman for Cambridge. What he's shown, as was shown by the honourable lady for Blaydon, and also by my honourable friend for Newcastle under Lyme, was a clear passion on this subject and raising some very serious and important constituency subjects. And I just want to assure them all we do agree that landfill tax fraud and wider waste crime is an important concern in itself, but it also has a distortive effect on legitimate waste management sector. Legitimate waste management businesses and the waste management sector, causes significant environmental damage and, of course, seriously impacts on local communities. And every single MP who's spoken today, with an emphasis, it should be said, on quality rather than quantity of colleagues participating, has clearly emphasised, above all else, the impact on their communities. And I totally understand and sympathise with this point. I will just canter through the history as the Honourable Gentleman did, because it's very important. Obviously, we had a long-established habit of landfilling our waste, but in fact, as recently as the 1990s, over 90% of household waste went to landfill, with only 5% of household waste being recycled. As the Honourable Gentleman for Cambridge said, a landfill tax was introduced. It was actually October 1996 to help remedy this. And the idea was to encourage the diversion of waste away from landfill and towards more environmentally friendly waste management options such as recycling, reuse and recovery. And having introduced the tax, it is also true, as the Right Honourable Member for North Durham North, pointed out, successive governments have applied escalators to that standard rate. These escalators increased the rate but also provided lead-in time and certainty, which was welcomed by the sector, who were looking to invest in more sustainable waste management options. This has been widely recognised as being successful in contributing to the fall in waste to landfill. And where we are now, since 2000, local authority waste sent to landfill in England has fallen by 90%. And household recycling rates are now at around 45%. The tax in the last financial year collected £667 million. Just bear with me. I actually think that is, in many ways, a successful tax. And obviously I'm speaking primarily from the Exchequer's point of view. But we have achieved a substantial policy goal there. And we should think of the parallel universe where we did not achieve that reduction in landfill. And imagine today how many square miles of our wonderful countryside would now be taken up by landfill. It's a striking thought. I give way to one gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way, and I don't want to intrude too much on this debate, but I think he's right when he's talking about the importance of moving more towards recycling and less to landfill. Would he join me in calling upon Glasgow City Council to reject the planning application from Patterson's of Green Oak Hill landfill site there, which blights communities in Mount Vernon, Carmyle, Bayleston and Broomhouse?
Here, here.
Well, it's fair to say the Honourable Gentleman's got that on the record, but he will appreciate I'm so not going to comment. It's as devolved as it is, but beyond that, it's also a planning matter and not a matter for the Exchequer. But he's got it on record, as I say. So it's true, landfill tax has inevitably been relatively difficult to enforce. There are high levels of non-compliance, and in part, and the Right Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right, this is due to increases in the standard rate, but obviously as the tax has increased, it's been more effective in incentivising disposal other than landfill, but inevitably there has been, in parallel, increase in abuse and non-compliance. So let me just turn to some of the specific points. I'll give way to the
Listen, as I said in my contribution to this debate, I've got no problem with the actual policy It has been effective. You question the figures because, frankly, nobody knows what the figures are. The Environment Agency don't know what the figures are. But what I can't get my head round is this, that he said it's been difficult to enforce. Well, talk to people in the industry. They've known this for years. They've known every scam that's been going on for the last 27 years, and nothing's been done. That's the bit I just don't understand.
I was just being frank with the right honourable gentleman. It is a relatively difficult tax compared to others, but that doesn't mean we aren't determined to do everything possible to deal with non-compliance. And let me just turn to some of these specific points that he and other colleagues raised during the debate. I just want to make a bit of progress. So turning to Operation Nosedive, which I think every single colleague raised, first of all, I have no information whatsoever on the etymology, it's fair to say. It is striking, it's fair to say. As honourable members know, the legal obligations related to taxpayer confidentiality mean it would be inappropriate for me to discuss the specific details of Operation Nosedive, but the Public Accounts Committee has acknowledged in its report that HMRC had been frank about the challenges associated with investigating these types of cases and that a high standard must be met for any criminal investigation to reach the prosecution stage. And I would just add, perhaps referring back to my previous role, as it were, that the Right Honourable for North Durham mentioned about the operational independence of HMRC, but perhaps the most fundamentally independent institutions in our constitution are the judiciary and, of course, CPS, independent prosecutors, and it is ultimately their decision as to whether to prosecute based on their evidential threshold. It's a pleasure to give way to Emily.
I thank you for giving way. I appreciate the fact. Of course, I asked questions about why it had happened and detail. And of course, I got the reply about the confidentiality bit. But does he not accept that after a period of, 6.5 years we know about and time before that, it's just not reasonable to say we can't tell you how much it costs because, that is a matter of public interest.
Well, as I understand, the figure is public. Following robust campaigning by colleagues present in this chamber, I understand that. But I just want to turn specifically to the linked point about this phrase decriminalisation. I just want to really emphasise an important point, that most of HMRC's work to tackle fraud makes use of civil powers, but HMRC does use criminal powers selectively, focusing criminal investigations at the top end of the highest harm and most complex organised crime and serious frauds. But just to underline this, for example, in the year 2020-21, HMRC closed 700 illegal waste sites, and that included 200 high-risk sites. That's HMRC. It could have been the Environment Agency as well. The point is there was significant action taken, but that action is primarily civil in nature. My honourable friend for Newcastle-under-Lyme continues to raise the issues of Wally's Quarry. I'm now on Wally's Quarry. I'm going to stick with Wally's Quarry. Similarly, and he will have anticipated this, I cannot comment on ongoing investigations, but I can confirm that, as I understand, the Environment Agency continues to closely regulate the operator and to consider appropriate action in accordance with its enforcement and sanctions policy. But whilst it sounds like actually there has been some progress, let me simply put this on record. My honourable friend is being an absolute stalwart constituency MP on this issue. He is a credit to his constituents. It is difficult for us at the dispatch box as government ministers to go into the detail in great depth, but he made the point about mental health impact and so on, and I do very much sympathise with those who've experienced firsthand the impact of this issue, but I give way to my right honourable friend.
Well, in a way, his comments on Wally's Quarry reinforce the point. He said this was a difficult area to enforce in tax terms. When you're making, firstly, I don't actually agree. I think in practical terms on the ground there's a great deal more that could have been done on Nosedive than was done in terms of physical investigation. It would not normally be undertaken, but something as big as this it should have been. But the simple point is I want to reiterate to him the point I made earlier to my honourable friend, and that is the costs of failure in enforcement in this are both financially enormous, socially disastrous, and from a policy point of view, serve to completely invert the purpose of the policy. The honourable gentleman speaking earlier, quoting the Industry Association, talked about an environmental disaster, environmental catastrophe waiting to happen. No, it's an environmental catastrophe waiting to be discovered, because much of it already lies under the land, under the ground in our constituency. So I bring it back to the point. This is an area where huge amounts of resource are at play, huge amounts of effort should be put into dealing with it.
Well, I totally understand where my right honourable friend is coming from. I mean, as you know, speaking generally on all the sort of cases and issues that we are presented with, and I will be going through all of the points raised as best as I can. I mean, I think, for example, he talks particularly about joint working and coordination. I will be coming on to that. But I think there is this, if you like, in principle point that we do have to accept. You have a tax whose rate and cost incentivises a behaviour which is a very positive policy goal and outcome, and that has been achieved to quite an extraordinary degree in many ways, which is, of course, the substantial and very substantial reduction in waste going to landfill. But precisely because of the mechanism you are using, which is a financial disincentive, it does lead some, and there will always be some rogue players, but it leads to those rogue actors to take advantage of it. Let me just, if I may, press on with some of the other specific points raised. I think all right honourable friends raised a point about data. I can confirm the government is committed to publishing a framework of indicators annually to track progress towards objectives set out in the resource and waste strategy. This includes indicators of waste crime, for example, indicators on illegal waste sites, fly tipping and littering. And I think it was both the right honourable gentleman for North Durham and Newcastle under Lyme who made the point about what constitutes a fit and proper person. So just to confirm, DEFRA recently consulted on reforms to the carrier broker dealer regime. This will mean those transporting or making decisions about waste must demonstrate they are competent to make those decisions, and DEFRA anticipates phased implementation of these reforms from year 23-24. Of course I give way.
Can I just ask a further question about that? It's good to hear that there will be some progress, but I think the issue is about the operators and permit holders of landfill sites. Is there to be any action on the fit and proper person test for that?
Well, I would strongly, Sheila presents a DEFRA consultation, so I would strongly encourage her to engage with it. She's an extremely assiduous contributor to these debates and campaign. In fact, I think she's been pretty much in every debate I've ever attended. So I pay tribute to her on that front, and I'm sure she will be pursuing that consultation with interest. Let me just talk briefly on the issue of the tax gap. It's a very good point, and actually my honourable friend for Newcastle under Lyme made the point that when we look at the tax gap, there was a particular spike because of including unauthorised sites. 2 years before we have the latest figures for year 2021, with a gap of 17.1%. That was a fall, but that's partly because the year before was, of course, COVID impacted, and the year before that was that year when we had the spike because of the inclusion of unauthorised sites. What I would say is, of course, we want to make further progress on it, but I think, and I speak for the Treasury as a whole, we should be judged as a government on the totality of the tax gap, because, of course, it will vary between different taxes. Some taxes are fundamentally easier to collect than others, some are easier to evade than others. My honourable friend made the point, it's now around 5.1%. It was in the last year for which we have figures available. That was a fall from about 7.5% in the year 2005-2006. That is one of the lowest that we know of in the world, one of the lowest published tax gaps in the world. It has been in decline, and that is very positive, and it shows that overall we are making effective progress. But I do agree we need to make more specifically in relation to landfill tax. I'll give way to the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I appreciate him giving way. On the related matter of trying to quantify the scale of fly tipping and its cost to local authorities and to residents and businesses, would he perhaps write to me on this matter? Because I appreciate it's not the subject he's talking about at the moment, but it is an enormous concern for many people across the country. In my own area of Reading, we have huge problems in the town centre and in other sites, often on private land, where there's enormous cost to neighbouring properties.
Yeah, I mean, he's right. It's certainly not within my bailiwick, as it were, but I'm happy for my official to get in touch with him to let them know who is the appropriate minister. If it is a waste incinerator, I mean, we should, I think, acknowledge that, of course, energy from waste plants have made an enormous contribution. One of the biggest factor in the reduction in landfill is the use of energy from waste plants. In Suffolk, my county, we have a very successful operation, and when the, as it were, landfill is burnt, this is used to create energy for homes. So it is a joined up operation, and it has made a massive difference. Just on the point of joint working, because I think it was my right on friend who's sort of darting around, made the point about it was a failure of sort of coordination. As he knows, in 2020 we established the Joint Unit for Waste Crime and the Environment Agency in partnership with HMRC, the National Crime Agency and others to tackle organised waste crime. Through shared intelligence and enforcement, the Joint Unit is identifying, disrupting and deterring criminals, and I can confirm between April 2020 and November 2022, the Joint Unit worked with over 100 partner agencies and engaged in 175 multi-agency days of action, resulting in 51 arrests by other agencies. Turning to the report by the Public Accounts Committee, which again, I think all colleagues have raised, as Honourable Right Honourable Members know, the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee last year published reports on government efforts to combat waste crime. Despite the work done to date, the government is not complacent and recognises that more needs to be done. That is why we accepted and are implementing all of the recommendations made in the Public Accounts Committee's report, Government Actions to Combat Waste Crime. And importantly, we're not going from a standing start. There are, as I say, a host of multi-agency efforts already underway, as I just demonstrated. The Honourable Lady from Blaydon mentioned the Landfill Tax Review. So I can confirm, as she said, we launched the Landfill Tax Review in 2021 to explore how the tax design can continue to support environmental goals. The Government is currently considering responses to the Landfill Tax Review call for evidence, which closed in February 2022, and we hope to issue a response in due course. The Public Accounts Committee has recommended that DEFRA should work with HMT and HMRC to ensure the current review of landfill tax takes into account the incentives that the tax is currently designated creates to commit waste crime. So we will be looking at that factor. We agree with that specific recommendation. I'll give way to him.
This is within his bailiwick, and it's the differential rates between the higher rates. And now, some would argue that that's incentive, which is, colleagues have said. But could he actually perhaps engage with the Environment Agency to actually look at the test and the way it's enforced for, labelling waste as inert? It is a farce, frankly. It allows the operator to do it themselves and then just put it forward as that bulk of waste. So at the top you might have some inert waste, under it frankly you'll have active waste. This is about enforcement. It's also about whether you should actually just abolish it altogether.
Well, I mean, the Right Honourable Gentleman makes a really important point. He'll appreciate I am not going to prejudge or predetermine our review, but it is important that we look at these precise points, and that's why we've established the review. And as I say, we will respond to the call for evidence and the responses we've received in due course. Can I just turn finally to HMRC, Mr Deputy Speaker? Obviously, lots of colleagues have raised this. A further recommendation from the PAC was that HMRC respond on how it has improved its approach to landfill tax prosecutions. It did this in December. Briefly, HMRC's approach to landfill tax compliance aims to collect the right amount of tax and support the government's aim to create a better environment. Most of their work to tackle tax fraud makes use of civil powers, as I said earlier, but they also use criminal powers selectively. HMRC has also learned lessons from previous operational activity and is currently developing a number of criminal investigations into those involved in waste crime. So, yes, there are ongoing investigations to confirm to the runner from North Durham, who is sort of chuntering, as it were, in his, from his position in his invisible anorak on the Labour backbench. This work is at an early stage of development. Sorry, the investigations are at an early stage of development, and the House will understand it is not appropriate to provide further detail at this point. But just turning lastly onto resourcing, colleagues, I think on both sides have raised the point about resourcing, including the Honourable Gentleman from Cambridge. HMRC is also deploying more resources to increase the number of civil investigations of landfill tax non-compliance. Actions between 2018 and 2021 have already secured £110 million of additional tax revenue, and in future we expect at least £50 million of extra tax to be paid annually. We've raised, HMRC increased the operational compliance resource dedicated to landfill tax in 2017 and 2018, doubling capacity to 50 people. And in addition, HMRC is deploying a further 10% more resources in 2023 compared to 2022 to specifically increase the number of civil investigations of landfill tax non-compliance. And this was funded in Spring Budget 2022. So to conclude, Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to thank the Landfill 4 today for their excellent contributions, and of course to the two right honourable gentlemen for bringing this debate before us. Landfill tax has helped transform the approach to waste and resource management with reductions in waste to landfill and increases in recycling rates. However, there is and will always be more work to be done to tackle criminals looking to take advantage of the system. Finding that balance, achieving both of those things is crucial, and I am determined that we will.
And the final word to Kevan Jones.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. First of all, can I thank my honourable friend, my parliamentary neighbour from Blaydon, for her contribution, the right honourable member for Halton Price and Houghton, and the honourable member for Newcastle-under-Lyme for their contributions. In terms of the outcome of this debate, what do we want? Well, I've got to say, the statement which the Minister just read out from HMRC didn't fill me with a great deal of confidence. It was great, good, flowery civil service language. But I think there are some asks that I would ask him to take away. One, I think, is the dedicated funding for the Joint Waste Unit, because I think we all agree that that is a way forward. I think the other thing I would ask in terms of use of the powers that exist is to look at, as part of that programme, not just in terms of criminal enforcement of landfill tax fraud, but whether or not with the National Crime Agents or others, some of the individuals involved could actually use legislation such as the Proceeds of Crime Act, which, you do better question why some people have become very wealthy out of this and where that money's come from. And finally, this is because this policy area, as you said, possibly has been successful, but it's also created a problem, not just in terms of lost revenue, but also in terms of funding criminality in this country. And it's partly because it's fallen between two departments. You've got the Treasury and you've got the DEFRA, and obviously two arm's length organisations in terms of the HMRC and DEFRA. Could I ask him, one ask, and that's that, is that he actually takes personal interest in this and actually coordinates and has a meeting with his opposite number in DEFRA to drive this agenda forward. Because my fear is, with all the good words we've heard today by officials, the Joint Crime Unit and everything else, without political muscle behind it and somebody watching over it, things will not move forward. Can I just warn him, I'm sure myself and the honourable member for Halton Price will not be looking the other way, and we'll be back onto this. But that is one way, I think, in which to drive this forward. It does definitely need a political lead on this, and I accept it as two ministers, but if those two individual ministers come together, that can make a difference.